I never imagined I would find myself standing at the edge of a harbor, clutching a crumpled bus ticket instead of the cruise ticket that was supposed to take me on the trip of a lifetime. Yet that's precisely where I was 2 years ago, with tears gathering at the corners of my eyes, watching my entire family step aboard a grand ship under a banner that read, "Let the shipping line be called Oceanic Lines." The ship's enormous silhouette, white and gold trim glimmering in the early afternoon sun, looked more like a floating city than a mere vessel. The sight of it promised 5 days of adventure, celebration, and long-awaited memories for everyone but me. I come from a family of 6. My parents, my sister, 2 other relatives, and me. I'll call those 2 other relatives my aunt and uncle, though they're close family friends rather than blood relatives. Still, everyone in the family called them Aunt Kay and Uncle Ray. Because there were 6 of us going, we had coordinated this family cruise for months. It was my dream to travel on an ocean liner, waking up to the sound of waves, walking the decks in the morning breeze, and sipping fruit juice while gazing at infinite blue horizons. My parents had saved for this trip, and I had looked forward to it for years, scraping together extra cash from part-time jobs and birthdays. I was so excited that I would have gladly slept in the cramped cabin corners if necessary, just to be part of the experience. Yet, on that fateful day, as we lined up to check our tickets, I discovered that mine was gone. All I found in the little envelope that had contained my personalized boarding pass was a chocolate wrapper, a piece of trash that must have been deliberately placed there to replace my ticket. My heart stopped. I couldn't speak, and my first impulse was to pat down every pocket, every bag, every corner of my jacket. The ticket had been there that same morning, but once we arrived at the port, it vanished. The staff at the ticketing station tried to help, but the line of excited travelers behind us was relentless, and the boarding time was almost up. I told the staff my name, but there was no way to verify me quickly since my official ticket had disappeared. The entire atmosphere was chaotic. My sister hovered off to one side, biting her lip, pretending to look concerned. My parents were in shock, and my aunt and uncle glanced between me and the rest of the family, unsure what to do next. They asked, "Should we cancel?" But it was the final day of check-in. Canceling the entire trip for all 5 of them at the last minute would forfeit all the money spent. With great reluctance, my parents decided they couldn't lose that investment. My sister quietly agreed, her eyes darting away whenever I tried to meet her gaze. Everyone muttered sympathetic words, but in the moment, no one questioned how my ticket had suddenly vanished. I felt like a little child again, overshadowed by everything with no power to fight back. And so I was left behind, an afterthought at the port. I remember the painful moment my father patted my shoulder and said, "I'm sorry," then hurried to catch up with the rest. The ship's horn blasted, a loud finality that told me they were leaving and I wasn't going with them. I stood there, shaky and unsettled, as the last of the passengers filed on board. That image, the massive gangway being retracted, the polished railings glinting in the sun, and the ship slowly drifting away, remains forever burned in my memory. I was alone in a bustling coastal city with nothing to occupy my time and no reason to stay. I took the bus back home, curling against the window, tears rolling down my cheeks. I stared vacantly at the passing scenery, tourist shops, street performers, all the vibrancy of a port town in summer. I wanted to scream, but no words came. By the time the bus dropped me off in my hometown, the sky had darkened, matching my mood. My apartment felt cold and empty. No one could give me a satisfactory explanation of what had happened to my ticket. My parents apologized profusely once they returned, but they simply said they had no idea. My sister, after their return, avoided me for weeks. She sent me half-hearted messages, something along the lines of, "I'm sorry it happened," never properly admitting any involvement. My aunt and uncle looked at me with pity. Deep down, I suspected some foul play. But how does one accuse family of such a cruel trick without proof? So I let the anger simmer within me. Life moved on, albeit with a bitterness that stuck to my tongue whenever I thought about that day. Over time, the memory settled like a nagging wound that wouldn't completely heal. I continued with my job, saving money and trying to push that humiliating moment to the back of my mind. My friendships carried on as well, although I noticed a subtle distance whenever the cruise fiasco was mentioned. The entire ordeal felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve. Who would benefit from removing my ticket? Then, 2 years later, everything became painfully clear. I was scrolling through a social media platform, one I used to keep up with old friends from school. Suddenly, I saw a video posted by someone I had once considered a friend, someone who also happened to be quite close to my sister. In the video, my sister, that friend, and a few others were playing a game they called At Least I Didn't Do Something. I'd never heard of it, but the rules were straightforward. You call out something outrageous or shameful your opponent did, and if they can't counter with an equally bad thing you did, you're off the hook. In the clip, they were all laughing. My sister was wearing a bright red sweatshirt and a smug grin. The friend turned to her and said, "At least I didn't hide the ticket to my brother's dream vacation." My sister's face flashed with surprise, and everyone cackled. Some of them even cheered as if it was all a harmless joke. I paused the video. My body trembled with rage. So it had been my sister all along. She'd sabotaged me so I would miss a trip that meant everything to me. But why? In the video, they bantered and teased, and the camera panned around, showing yet more faces I recognized from my own circle of friends. They were all in on it. They'd known this entire time. That betrayal stung me almost as much as losing the trip itself. For 2 years, she'd lied to me. She'd let me believe it might have been an accident or some random mishap, when in fact, she had orchestrated it so that she could have the family's undivided attention and, presumably, stand out as the fun sibling during the cruise. In the end, everyone had known, and no one had told me. Even our mutual friends had treated it like some hysterical anecdote, a twisted prank they laughed about behind my back. That single moment changed my life. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak, each emotion came crashing down like tidal waves. My sister, who shared a small part of my apartment, had taken advantage of me not just once, but repeatedly, living rent-free because I believed family should help each other. I let her stay out of goodwill. Now, that goodwill had become a raging inferno inside my chest. 2 years of lost sleep, 2 years of wondering how the ticket vanished, 2 years of playing polite sibling because I didn't want to accuse her without proof. I knew what I had to do. I stormed out of work that day, fueled by a clarity I hadn't possessed before. I reached my apartment, my mind running a mile a minute. When I flung open the door to the place, I heard her voice from the living room. She tried to greet me, but I cut her off by pointing my phone at her. "I saw the video," I said, every syllable sharp. Her eyes widened. She sputtered something about it being a joke and that I should relax. I felt my veins pulsate. All the illusions of sibling harmony shattered at once. I told her, "Pack your things. Get out of my apartment. You have until the end of the day." She tried to laugh it off, then tried to shift into apology mode, but it was far too late for either. I could see desperation break across her face. She pleaded with me to calm down, to talk it over, or give her a chance to explain. But betrayal is a line that, once crossed, can rarely be undone. My entire being was anchored in resentment. "This place is mine," I growled. "I let you stay as a courtesy, and you used that time to brag about what you did behind my back." Her voice shook as she tried to give me excuses. Some ridiculous notion that she wanted a chance to be seen as the star child on the cruise, that she'd gotten tired of being overshadowed, that she never imagined it would hurt me that badly. I bit back a bitter laugh. "You never imagined? You replaced my ticket with a chocolate wrapper. I was alone for days, crying on a bus home, and you saw it. Then you lied to me for 2 years. You never even tried to apologize." She insisted that she had felt guilty. She insisted that our parents gave her extra attention on that trip, but she hated herself every day. Another lie, obviously. Why else would she brag in a social media game if she felt remorseful? There was no guilt in that laughter from the video. She tried to beg for forgiveness, but I reminded her that I'd watched her smirk in that footage, delighting in my humiliation with all those so-called friends. As she took her suitcase out of the closet, she turned back to me for a moment, her eyes wet. "We're family," she repeated, clinging to that last desperate straw. I merely stared at her, expressionless. "Exactly," I replied, "and you never should have betrayed your own family." She tried every angle. She said I was overreacting. She said I was punishing her for a childish prank. She said she'd pay me back for the cost of the cruise. But there was no bridging that gulf. Every word felt like a further mockery of my trust. She gathered her clothes in crumpled bundles. I stood by the doorway, arms crossed, ensuring she didn't linger in my space any longer. That day, I shut the door on her. Later, my phone buzzed incessantly. 39 missed calls from her number and countless texts from mutual acquaintances, all telling me she had nowhere to go. She was stuck. She had no plan, no job security. But every time my phone rang, I felt a savage satisfaction that she finally tasted the consequences of her betrayal. "Keep calling," I muttered to myself as I blocked her. "I'm done." I had never felt more justified and at the same time more alone, because it wasn't just her who had stabbed me in the back. All those friends, my entire social circle, had been aware of this plot. They'd made it a running joke, apparently, so that meant my circle was gone too. If your friends can't be honest about something that catastrophic, they're not worth your time. I removed them all from my social media. Their messages protesting the eviction or calling me harsh or vindictive went straight to the trash. To make matters worse, my parents, who found out about the sister's confession, tried to mediate. They phoned me, urging me to calm down. Mom said, "Please, hear her out." Dad said, "She already did it and can't change the past." It infuriated me that they would take such a diplomatic tone when the harm she'd done was immeasurable. "You do whatever you want with her, but in my home, she's not welcome," I told them. They tried guilt trips. "We're family," they repeated in every phone call, but the words rang hollow. I suppose, in a twisted sense, my sister did suffer for her wrongdoing. Without a job, she had to crash on various acquaintances' sofas, or so I heard. Eventually, she might have ended up in a cheap hostel, maybe even returned to our hometown to live with our parents. I never found out the details because I refused to see or speak to her. She was out of my life for good. As for those who had laughed with her, I severed ties. If someone betrays you, they have no business being in your life. That's a lesson I would carry forever after. Let me backtrack to the start of all this, not to rehash the details, because once is enough, but to illustrate how I had grown up believing my sister and I were close. We'd shared a childhood room for many years. She borrowed my crayons when we were toddlers. I helped her tie her shoes. We went to the same schools. I protected her from bullies, or so I thought. She was quiet, but also manipulative in subtle ways that I never really noticed until reflecting on our past. In high school, if I excelled at a project, she'd find a way to point out flaws so she'd get more praise. I chalked that up to sibling rivalry. If I made a new friend, she'd swoop in and charm them. I imagined she was just being friendly. If I saved money for something special, she'd borrow some and conveniently forget to give it back until I asked multiple times. None of it felt like a betrayal then, just annoying sibling squabbles. I convinced myself it was normal. It wasn't until she deprived me of that cruise, something I had anticipated for years, that her jealousy and manipulation took on a more insidious shape. She replaced my ticket, then let me suffer the heartbreak while she basked in our parents' attention on the ship. And by the time I discovered the truth, she and her friends had turned it into a sick joke. Yes, she faced her own brand of punishment. She lost her comfortable living arrangement, and her reputation suffered among anyone who heard the full story. But that was small consolation for the emotional damage I endured. I was determined, however, not to let that betrayal define me forever. I needed a real coping mechanism. I thought about traveling somewhere else by myself, some alternate dream trip. Why should her sabotage stop me from exploring the world? I had saved up enough over those 2 years to afford something modest. Maybe not a luxurious cruise, but a solid, well-planned vacation. Without telling anyone in my family, I booked a 10-day trip to a coastal region. I didn't want to mention the location by name. I'll just say it was a chain of sun-drenched islands that tourists flock to. I'd never visited them, but I'd always wanted to see those turquoise waters. The week after I kicked my sister out, I put in for my vacation time and flew there. It was my form of quiet revenge against the entire situation, living my dream on my own terms, refusing to let her sabotage define me. The flight felt surprisingly liberating. I recall looking out the airplane window at the clouds, thinking, no one can ruin this for me. No one can hide this ticket. I landed in a small airport where the air smelled of salt and tropical flowers. My shoulders relaxed for the first time in years. The sun warmed my skin, and the gentle hum of palm trees swaying in the breeze lulled me into a serene state. I rented a room at a small guest house, modest but comfortable enough. Every morning I strolled along the beach, my feet pressed into soft white sand, and small waves lapped at my ankles, erasing footprints as quickly as they were formed. In that place, I felt free from the weight of betrayal. For hours, I would lounge under the shade of a large striped umbrella, read novels I'd never had time for, and listen to the distant laughter of other travelers who seemed infinitely more carefree than I'd been back home. In the afternoons, I explored the local markets. I found vibrant hand-woven baskets, fresh tropical fruit, and local delicacies. The locals were cheerful and welcoming, their joy infectious. One evening, I visited a small beachside eatery, an open-air establishment with lanterns hung on palm trunks. The ocean sparkled just beyond the tables. I remember ordering a platter of grilled seafood, the kind that practically melted in my mouth. For once, I wasn't haunted by anger. My mind wasn't consumed with thoughts of my sister's betrayal. I felt like a new person, shedding an old skin. But that's not to say I ever forgave her. My view on forgiveness changed after that incident. To me, forgiveness must be earned through genuine remorse and some act of atonement. Hiding a ticket to sabotage someone's dream and then bragging about it to friends. That doesn't deserve forgiveness, especially without any real attempt at reparation. She only apologized when cornered. I never believed in forced apologies. During my time on that island, I practiced letting go of the resentment, not for her benefit, but for mine. I recognized the difference between healthy closure and naive forgiveness. I sought closure, an end to my illusions about who my sister was, a final acceptance that she might never be the person I thought. That acceptance grounded me. By the time I left the island, I no longer felt that white-hot fury or the urge to dwell on fantasies of retribution. My immediate act of retaliation, kicking her out and blocking her, was done, and that was enough. The rest of my life was waiting for me to take control. When I got back, the news of the eviction had spread among my extended family. My parents were distraught, complaining that I'd escalated the conflict. Aunt Kay and Uncle Ray tried to remain neutral, though I sensed they secretly believed I'd done the right thing. Some relatives asked if I'd consider letting my sister stay again, reasoning that two wrongs don't make a right. I politely told them that this wasn't about petty vengeance or orchestrating a new wrongdoing. It was about self-respect and boundaries. Maybe in some families, betrayals like this get dismissed as pranks or overshadowed by bigger crises. But for me, it cut to the core. I had always prided myself on my loyalty and generosity. For years, my sister exploited that. Kicking her out was the line in the sand, the moment I decided my kindness wouldn't be used against me again. If she wants to talk, I told them, she can do it from wherever she's staying now. I won't speak to her directly, though. I've blocked her. She knows why. A part of me wondered if she'd ever truly understand the gravity of what she did. Months passed, and I rarely heard anything aside from secondhand tidbits. She's struggling to find a job, or she's complaining about not being forgiven, or she's thinking of moving back in with your parents. I never inquired further. It was no longer my problem. Interestingly, some of her so-called friends turned on her after the truth came out. A rumor reached me that one friend, who had tried to blackmail her into giving them money, ended up telling more people about the sabotage. She faced more backlash than she expected. People began to see her as untrustworthy. Without a stable place to live or a strong support system, she lost the circle that had once found her so entertaining. That was her penance. I received a few messages from mutual acquaintances apologizing to me, asking for a second chance. They admitted they'd known my sister's secret but were afraid to say anything. One friend wrote, "I was too scared to ruin your relationship. I thought your sister would come clean on her own." I declined to rekindle those friendships. I had learned that anyone who actively concealed such a betrayal for years is not someone I want in my life. Let them face their regrets alone. I didn't go looking for revenge on every person who'd laughed at my expense, but I distanced myself from them completely. Some tried to spin it as if I was being unforgiving, but I saw it as self-preservation. Let them feel the consequences of their inaction and complicity. With the family rift gaping wider, I decided to channel my energy into personal growth. Over the months that followed, I applied for a better position at my workplace and moved to a more spacious apartment, one fully under my name and far away from any chance encounters with my sister. The new building overlooked a small green park, a refreshing shift from the dull gray cityscapes I used to endure. Every morning I'd sip tea by the window, gaze at people jogging or walking their dogs, and think about how far I'd come since that humiliating day at the port. Sometimes old memories would resurface, me standing at the harbor, that sinking feeling in my stomach when I realized I'd been betrayed. I'd recall the bus ride back home, tears streaming down my face. But instead of letting it incapacitate me, I used that memory as a reminder of what I'd survived. That shock and pain were real, but I was still here, forging a future on my own terms. There was a point when my mother tried to organize a family talk to patch things up. She invited me to dinner at her house, apparently planning to have my sister there as well. I found out a few days beforehand. Needless to say, I refused. I told my mother plainly. She betrayed me. She bragged about it. She let me suffer. I don't need closure from her. I've made my peace. I'm not attending any forced reconciliation. My mother insisted we should at least attempt to be civil, but I don't believe in forced civility. People often say, family is everything, but family is only everything if that's backed by trust. She had shattered that trust for a twisted motive, attention. So, as far as I was concerned, that relationship was dead. My mother wept and threatened to cut contact with me if I didn't come to the dinner, but I refused to be manipulated by emotional blackmail. I calmly stated, "I love you, Mom, but if you're going to support her actions under the guise of family unity, I will have to limit my communication with you too." That stunned her into silence. I think she realized at that point that I was serious. She never tried that tactic again. Perhaps the biggest turning point for me, outside of the eviction and blocking spree, was deciding to revisit the port town on my own terms. I'd spent so long feeling haunted by that place, by the memory of being left behind, that I needed to reclaim it. So about a year after kicking my sister out, I took a weekend trip back to that same harbor. When I arrived, I recognized the same bus station where I had tearfully returned home. It was midday, and the salty breeze carried the usual chorus of street vendors. I inhaled deeply, letting the tang of the sea fill my lungs, and forced myself to walk back to the pier. This time, I wore comfortable sneakers and a light jacket, determined to face the ghosts of my past. The sun glinted off the water and gulls circled overhead. I watched another cruise ship docking in the distance. It wasn't the same vessel from that day, but seeing a gargantuan liner reminded me of those stolen dreams. I strolled around the pier, noticing families with excited children, couples holding hands, and groups of friends snapping photos. Observing them triggered a slight pang of jealousy, but mostly I felt acceptance. It was no longer my dream to take that family cruise. I had found a better dream: independence, clarity, and forming relationships with people who valued honesty. I spent that afternoon wandering through the narrow streets around the harbor, sampling fried fish from a quaint little shack and buying souvenirs I'd ignored the first time. By dusk, the sky blazed orange and purple, reflecting off the gentle waves. I paused near the water's edge, recalling how I had once stood there in despair, the ship's horn echoing in my ears as it sailed without me. This time, I felt no tears, just a calm sense that the worst was behind me. I left the port at peace, taking a slow bus ride back to my new apartment. I watched the coastline fade in the distance and felt a calm power in knowing I had faced my sorrow head on. Life has a way of moving forward, no matter how deep the scars. After my second trip to that port town, I returned to my usual routine, but with a difference. I carried no illusions about my sister. Word reached me that she was still drifting, moving from job to job, place to place. Whenever someone tried to pass along messages from her, apologies, pleas, or attempts to share news, I declined. I set a boundary, and I refused to break it. If someone betrays you in such a profound way, you're not obligated to let them back into your life. Some might call it extreme, but for me, it was necessary. I had to protect my emotional well-being. A small circle of new friends entered my life, people who had no connection to my sister's betrayal. Our friendships were built on sincerity and open communication. I never told them the full story. I didn't need to. That chapter was closed. Occasionally, extended family members tried to weave elaborate scenarios to get me and my sister in the same place at the same time, but I always caught wind of it. I was vigilant. When I politely told them I wouldn't come, they sighed in frustration, but eventually they stopped trying. They saw that I was resolute. Did my sister ever face more consequences for her actions? I know that on at least one occasion, a friend of hers posted something unflattering online, hinting at her manipulative nature. She might have lost more connections that way. As far as I was concerned, the karmic outcome was playing out for her. She had done something cruel and then boasted about it. Now she was reaping what she sowed. Some nights, I reflect on the entire saga. I realize it all started from envy. My sister's envy that I'd saved money for a dream trip. Envy that I'd have a spotlight in front of our parents. Envy that, for once, the family's attention might be on me instead of her. That envy morphed into betrayal. Betrayal led to the severing of our relationship, and ironically, by seeking that spotlight so aggressively, she ended up alienated from the very people she wanted to impress. If that isn't poetic justice, I don't know what is. Now, I still have some contact with my parents, though our relationship feels strained. They know better than to mention my sister. My father respects that boundary, but my mother still tries to slip in remarks like, "She misses you," or "she's sorry." I always change the subject. She doesn't push the matter too far anymore, sensing that my mind is set. I suppose if there's a lesson to be gleaned from my experience, it's that we shouldn't ignore red flags just because someone is family. If someone repeatedly undermines you, if they sabotage you for their own gain, that is not an accident. It's part of who they are. And you have the right to protect yourself from such toxicity. I went from devastated to furious, from furious to numb, and finally, from numb to empowered. I found that real healing came only after I took a stance, drawing a firm line and enforcing consequences. Letting my sister get away with it or laughing it off would have torn me up inside. By standing up for myself, I preserved a sense of dignity that can't be measured in simple forgiveness. I realized, too, that any illusions of almost never forgiving a betrayal can be harsh. But sometimes you need that firmness. There are betrayals that sever ties forever, and that's perfectly valid. You can still move on and live a fulfilling life without offering someone a path back into your trust. Not every rift must end in a tearful reunion. Sometimes, cutting someone out is the healthiest choice. I don't regret my decision. I only regret not discovering the truth sooner. Perhaps if I'd known from the start that she was behind the missing ticket, I'd have severed ties and moved on with my life that much earlier. But I guess we all learn at our own pace. By the time I uncovered her treachery, I was prepared to act decisively, and I did. In a final twist, one day I received a letter in the mail. There was no return address on the envelope, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. I'm sorry for everything. I hope one day we can talk. I never intended to lose you forever. I stared at that letter for a long time. I could practically see her tear stains on the ink, but words are cheap, especially when typed or scrawled on a page. The fact remained. She'd stolen my ticket, humiliated me, and bragged about it. She'd let 2 years pass while I floundered in confusion and heartbreak. I kept the letter in a drawer for a while, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of what betrayal does to relationships. Eventually, I tossed it out. I felt no compulsion to respond or reconnect. Just disposing of it felt like another act of self-liberation, like discarding the last tether to her manipulative presence in my life. So here I am now, sharing this story from my own perspective, minus all the illusions I once held about unbreakable family bonds. My sister's betrayal was a wound that nearly shattered me, but I made sure that anyone who dared to wrong me so deeply faced real consequences. I'm not proud of the anger I carried, but I am proud I stood up for myself. Every antagonist in my life, every person who participates in cruelty, eventually reaps the outcome of their actions. No one who invests in malice gets a free pass. I like to think I've grown since that day by the harbor, the day I discovered a chocolate wrapper where my ticket should have been. The me of today is more cautious, more guarded. I watch for signs of envy and manipulation in people. I learned that sometimes you cannot salvage a relationship tainted by betrayal. It's not about revenge alone, but self-preservation. If I had let her remain under my roof, accepted a lukewarm apology, and continued as though nothing happened, I would have betrayed myself. Some might ask if I'd ever consider hearing her out in the far future, perhaps decades from now. The answer is simple. Maybe I'd listen to what she has to say, but I won't pretend the betrayal didn't happen, and I won't open the door to the same dynamic again. She lost that chance the moment she turned my dream cruise into her twisted game. Looking back, one might say my sister's envy ironically did me a favor. It forced me to break free from toxic ties and discover my own strength. Without her sabotage, I might have never realized the depth of her cruelty or the shallow loyalty of so many so-called friends. They removed themselves from my life once they participated in that humiliating secret. I emerged with a fresh slate, an open path to cultivate new friendships and experiences. All this began with a single motive I never saw coming. She wanted attention. Sole, starry-eyed attention from our family. I was the inconvenient obstacle. By removing me from the equation, she thought she'd shine brighter, get all the praise she craved. The irony is that in doing so, she lost the one person who might have genuinely cared about her well-being. So if you ever find yourself blindsided by betrayal, remember my story. People who truly love you don't swap your ticket for a chocolate wrappers so they can hog the limelight. If they do, they've marked themselves as an antagonist in your life's narrative, and it's only right that their actions have consequences. Don't feel guilty for shutting them out. Don't feel obligated to forgive just because someone shares your blood. Trust is fragile, and once it's broken, sometimes the only way to heal is to leave the shattered pieces behind and walk away. I left mine behind that day I kicked her out. She's on her own now, and I'm on my own path, free of illusions, free of manipulative games, and free to pursue the next dream that catches my eye, ticket firmly in hand.